I must say, you are a fantastic audience. You have settled yourselves, and then you even timed the expectant hush perfectly for bang on 11 o'clock. I mean, if only this kind of efficiency could be seen across the UK economy. I'm Timandra Harkness. I'm chairing this session in spite of not knowing very much about economics. And I suddenly had a terrible flashback this morning that quite a long time ago, I was asked to chair a session called "Are We Talking Our Way into a Recession?" And the panel were agreed that there was a great danger of talking the economy down, and actually underlying things were like no worse than they had been. But this was in 2007. And so within weeks of the event, we were, in fact, in a full-scale global financial crisis. So I would just like to say that correlation is not causation. And if, in fact, the UK economy collapses in the next few weeks, it's not my fault. All right. So we have a fantastic panel, but it has slightly changed. I was going to, until this morning, I could have said that we'd achieved growth of 25% on the panel because we had an extra speaker, but then he unfortunately had to pull out this morning because his child is sick. But we still have a change to the panel, as you can see. Karl is not Richard Tice, just in case anybody was confused about this. So I'm going to introduce the panel that we actually have, and they're going to speak for 5 to 8 minutes each, the usual, very, very short. And then we will come out and you can make your arguments and your points and your questions, and I'll come back and let them chip back in. A lot of you will have been here yesterday and you know the score, or even in previous years. So it's very much the usual format, and we run until 12:30. I'm going to introduce the panel in the order in which they're going to speak. We have Professor Vicky Pryce, Chief Economic Advisor and Board Member for the Centre for Economics and Business Research. She's the author of How to Be a Successful Economist, but also of the forthcoming book, Mismanaged Decline. Very apt and relevant. Next, we have Jon Moynihan, businessman, former chair of Vote Leave, Conservative peer, and the author of Return to Growth, How to Fix the Economy. I don't know if you have a copy here with you, Jon, that you could wave at the audience. There you go. Then we have Karl Williams, who's kindly stepped in at relatively short notice, in fact, who's a research director of the Centre of Policy Studies, specialising in political economy. Regrettably, he's still working on his book, so we feel it's too early to plug it. And then finally, we have Rob Lyons, who's the Science and Technology Director of the Academy of Ideas and the convener of the Academy of Ideas Economy Forum. He's the author of Panic on a Plate, but that was 2011. So you're probably due to write another book, Rob. I mean, everybody else is. I think you should keep up. So I'm not going to talk anymore. You've heard enough from me. So Vicky, tell us, do you think are we doomed? What's things looking like at the moment?
Shall I do this standing up? Because so that people can see. Yeah? Okay, I'll stand up. Now, it doesn't mean that everyone else has to stand up, and maybe they will. First of all, on the red and yellow cards, I'm a football fan, and my team, Chelsea, seem to have got yet another red card yesterday.
Red and yellow.
We seem to be getting one every time, so I'm going to be very careful about my timing, so I don't do that as well. I'm going to talk about the economy. So I was given this task of just filling you in on what's going on before everyone else tells you, what should be done about it, hopefully. I'm quite a pessimist, I have to say. I do quite a lot of media stuff, and I haven't found any real serious reason for being optimistic about the UK economy for a while now. But of course, it was happening from before, and you got to remember that there were things that were left for this government to do which were almost impossible to deal with. And I'm not talking about the 14 years of disaster. I'm talking about just before the election, when Jeremy Hunt decided, now, if it wasn't for reform, I think he probably would be laughing all the way, or the Conservatives, all the way to the next election. But reform has sort of scuppered that a little bit for them. Because what he did is, if you remember, although most people don't remember, he cut national insurance contributions for employees by 2% effective in January 2024. So that was just a few months before the election. And then by another 2% in April 2024. Now, who noticed this? Now, come on, hands. Who noticed that this was really happening? Okay, very small percentage. The clever ones that look at their payslip notice that. Of course, if you were a pensioner, you wouldn't notice it because you don't pay national insurance contributions anyway. But it was a giveaway to the working people. Do you remember how much it was? Anyone can shout how much it was each time.
2%.
It was 2% indeed, and another 2%. In terms of the size, in terms of pounds, billions of pounds, it was 10 billion giveaway in January and another 10 billion giveaway in April. What does that give you? The 20 billion black hole, which Rachel Reeves got. And of course, having made the promise not to increase national insurance contributions rate or the income tax rate or VAT, she got stuck. But of course, she could have done that immediately, reversed it and said, whoops, we just discovered this. We all knew that from the outside. The Institute of Fiscal Studies was saying it, everyone else was saying. So she got this real problem to begin with and not able to reverse that. In addition, of course, the Conservatives hadn't put any money aside for all the asylum seekers, hotels and everything else. They hadn't done anything about getting through the application. So they left the Labour Party or the Labour government with all sorts of problems to deal with. And the question for us is, have they dealt with it properly? And the answer probably is, for the moment, if you look at the economy, the answer is no. Because, of course, what they had to do in order to get that 20 billion is to raise national insurance contributions for employers. And, of course, we have seen what the result of that is, higher inflation because prices are going up. We've seen hirings coming down. And we've also seen profits being affected in a way. And less increase in wages too than would otherwise have been the case. Now, of course, that's a positive thing in some ways, not for people who work, but for the Bank of England, which might actually reduce interest rates because of that rather than anything else. So this is the position we're in. Plus, on the debt side, I mean, the thing to remember again, I'm just laying the foundations, and I'm sure we can discuss that a lot more afterwards. What Rachel Reeves did, why we have a real problem now with the debt situation, which I was asked to touch on, is that also in the first budget a year ago, what she did is she raised spending by the new government by comparison to what Jeremy Hunt had done in his March budget. Remember, he also cut national insurance contributions. But even so, she increased spending by 70 billion a year more than what had been in the March budget. 70 billion a year. How was she going to fund that? Of course, a lot of it has gone to the NHS. I mean, we've seen some improvements taking place, perhaps. But that was going to be financed as follows. 40 billion from tax increases, so the national insurance contributions, capital gains tax and everything else she did, non-doms, etc., and 30 was going to be borrowed. Now, that's a lot of money that you go out and borrow every year additionally. So over the Parliament. And she was allowed actually to do a little bit more because the Office of Budget Responsibility decided to change rules a little bit, the fiscal rules that say you've got to reduce your debt to GDP ratio by the end of 5 years. So in this case, it will be just before the next Parliament. And also that you should not borrow for day-to-day spending. So, and they changed the rules by allowing a lot of the investment which the government was making, quite a lot of it good investment. We've seen the industrial strategy, lots of money being spent. They would allow the change that makes to your productivity and therefore faster growth into your forecast for growth, and therefore your revenues, perhaps your GDP therefore would be slightly higher, and your debt to GDP ratio would also come into some sort of within the control that you wanted, which of course at present is nearly 100% debt to GDP ratio. So they allowed that extra spending. So there was even more borrowing that took place. All hopefully good for public for the economy. But what this has done, if you add to that the fact that the Bank of England has been selling the bonds that it acquired during the period of COVID when it helped the government finance its extra spending, which we all needed, it's accumulated huge amounts of bonds itself on his balance, on his books. So he's been selling those at a level of 100 billion a year. Now at a rate of 100 billion. Now 100 billion a year plus 30 plus of borrowing a year. That of course means that the markets begin to think, what is going on in terms of the debt that we have to be buying for you guys? And of course our rates, mortgage rates, therefore, our yields are high. Mortgage rates are high, and that's another concern. So that is depressing companies' willingness to go out and invest. And there are serious concerns about household finances because those rates are staying high. So many people remortgage and so on. So we got this problem. In addition, of course, we have self-induced higher inflation in the UK by comparison to other countries because of the way that we run our electricity market, for example, water bills and everything else. That's pushed everything up. So that we have a problem there. So what do we expect then for growth? Just to finish off. Well, this year isn't going to look too bad. That's one positive thing. And the reason why it's not going to look too bad, despite the fact that we had no growth basically in the last couple of months that where the data is there. So we had a decline in July and we had a slight increase in August, which means 0 for 2 months. It is because of tariffs. I mean, there's geopolitics out there, which I didn't touch on yet, which of course makes the whole thing a little bit more worrying. And of course, we have a deal with the US, but the reality is that that deal is still being developed. Pharmaceuticals, etc., still a problem in terms of what we can judge. So, what happened in the UK by comparison to what had been happening the previous 6 months in the first half of the 2025 is that everybody produced as much as they possibly could and sold to the US before the tariffs went up. Not just us, but also Europe. That is all stopped. If you look at manufacturing production right now, it's really declining. Even if you look at services, it's flattening the growth in the last couple of months now, including September. So that's a real worry. So we got reasonable growth, and Rachel Reeves can claim that we were really growing quite fast in the first half, but actually we're not really doing very well now. And also, even if you look at GDP, the reality is that GDP per person has been declining, and it's at the lowest increases, but it's been at the lowest rate of increase of all other G7 countries, because of course we had a population increase, lots of immigration and so on. So in terms of what will happen next, the question now is, in terms of the debt and how much she needs to raise in this budget, depends on whether the Office of Budget Responsibility, which has looked at these trends that I mentioned, good growth in the first half, but slowing down in the second half, still giving us possibly 1.3% growth for the year as a whole. What will they think about later? Are they going to think that productivity is going to really increase because of all the spending the government is doing? Maybe. If they do, then we have high growth, which means that the debt to GDP ratio will be lower. As you can calculate, if you have higher GDP, however much you borrow, then your debt reduces as a percentage of GDP if it grows faster, if GDP grows faster. It remains to be seen. But the overall assessment by economists is that she's going to have to raise anywhere between 30 and 40 billion, which is going to hit us all. Whether it is directly or indirectly remains to be seen. There are suggestions possibly of a wealth tax, but also property taxes going up, and loads of other things that she's contemplating at present. But just think how much easier life would have been if she had just reversed immediately the first national insurance contributions, the two national insurance contributions cuts that Jeremy Hunt had made. But because she didn't, and because of what she had to do, the mood went down. Confidence remains very, very low, both business and consumer confidence. So I'm suspecting that the OBR forecasts are not going to give us huge source for optimism, huge cause for optimism when they come, and that indeed we will be taxed again. Okay.
Morning, everybody. I'll follow Vicky's lead in standing up. Before any of you at the back shout stand up, I am standing up. I'm worried you're going to get a little bit of a monoculture here, because with the CPS and Vicky and myself, we tend not to disagree on too many things, although I think I'm going to say some very different things than what Vicky just said about the economy. In volume 2 of my magnificent book, Return to Growth, for sale upstairs as it happens, there's a chapter on what Vicky was talking about, and we're very much in line with each other. In volume 1, however, an even more magnificent and weighty tome, unfortunately not for sale upstairs, but you can find it at all good bookshops. It basically says that there are 3 big things that determine whether your economy is going to grow or not: the size of your government, the size of your taxes, and the degree of regulation. And never forget the third, because I am actually coming more and more to believe that that is the most important thing. The fact is that if you're regulated to death, your economy will not grow. Size of government. Tony Blair inherited what was called the best economy in Europe from a much divided government, the John Major crowd, who were just sort of implementing a lot of what Margaret Thatcher had done. And Tony Blair kept the Tory spending plans for 3 years. And by the end of that 3 years, in the year 2000, we were growing faster than anybody. We were actually paying off our debt. But one of the rare instances of actually spending less than we were getting in taxes, because taxes were pouring in because the economy was doing so well. And we had a fabulous economy. Enter Gordon Brown, starts spending like a drunken lunatic. And so at the time we had a government that was 1/3 of GDP. And now we have one that's coming up to 1/2 of GDP. And that is, according to all the numbers, which I show here, an inevitable massive decline in economic growth. Taxes. You've got to raise taxes, otherwise you're in the kind of bind that Vicky was talking about. And so if you've got very high taxes, that also is independently correlated with very low economic growth. And it's not just the taxes, it's also the kind of taxes. And this is where I would veer away a little bit from Vicky. We have a tax base that's very heavily weighted towards penalizing businesses, for example, with NIC, towards penalizing entrepreneurs, and towards, in fact, as we have seen, driving entrepreneurs and non-doms out of this country. And that was an absolutely catastrophic mistake. We were the heartland of where capital would come into this country to build new businesses, because we had a fabulous scientific base, academic base. We were nice to people who brought money in, and if you wanted to be a non-dom, fine, you can stay here and you won't pay taxes on. You'll pay tax on what you do here, but not on what you earn outside. We've gotten rid of all of that, and so they're all going off to Milan, to Dubai, to Monte Carlo, to Australia, to New York, anywhere but here. We are now the least attractive place to come and start a business, or in fact bring your wealth and live here. So it's the way that you get your taxes just as much as how great your taxes are, and that's all absolutely brilliantly discussed in volume 1. And there's also a great deal of discussion about, can you actually get the kind of revenues you think you can get by raising taxes in the kind of way that Vicky was saying Rachel Reeves is going to have to do. And what this shows is, no, actually you can't. Because if you raise taxes, people actually, being human beings, respond. And they do things in response to having raised taxes, like leaving the country, but also like going black, going into the black economy. Lots of people say, well, this tax rate too high for me, I'll just get cash, or retiring early. Huge numbers of people are retiring early because they just can't bear the taxes or the regulation, which is now absolutely ridiculous. And this is this was the main reason when I used to go around and campaign for Brexit in 2016. It's the main reason that I'm against the EU. It introduces the Napoleonic concept, which is that everything that is not explicitly permitted is forbidden. You will do things this way. And that's the driving impulse of Brussels, that they will get how you make a product, how you run your business. All of it is defined because we know best. And those of you who are adherents of Hayek know that he wrote a book called The Fatal Conceit, which is, no, you don't know best. You can't run an economy from the center. You have to have free markets where people make their own decisions, and that's how economies grow. We have the common law, which for centuries has had the view anything that's not explicitly prohibited is allowed. And in that way, we became the richest country in the world. But bit by bit, starting with that Blairite project, where...
Mike's gone.
Bit by bit, starting with that Blairite human rights project, where everything became about rights rather than responsibilities, regulation after regulation has constrained what you can do, so that businesses are just saying, forget about this, I'm giving up. Now, if it's those three things, and I think I make a fairly fair fist of showing that that's the case, example around the world of how free markets create economic growth with small government, low taxes, and low regulation. If that's the case, then we've had it. But if you look at the OBR analysis, they never mention one of those three things: size of government, taxes, regulation. They say Brexit has decreased our GDP by 4%. And a group of us in the House of Lords are about to write a letter to the chairman of the OBR calling him out on that, because it's absolutely disgraceful when you look at the claims that they're making. They have absolutely no validity whatsoever. Well, Liz Truss crashed the economy. Oh, yes, really? Well, that was a brilliant thing to do in 43 days. And so forth. If you look at what the OBR said, they don't have a clue. And their forecasts have over and over again for 20 years been absolutely hopeless. Every time they say, oh, growth is going to shoot up now that we've got a new budget, it never does. It's been hopeless for the last 25 years. What assumptions do they use? An example, I gave a speech where I pointed out that the OBR's, how long have I got?
Well,
Yellow card. The OBR says that every immigrant that comes to our country comes alone with no dependents, always gets a job, 100% of them get a job, and therefore, more immigration you've got, the more the economy will go up. How has that worked out? The IFS, I spent some time with Perplexity yesterday, and I said, Perplexity, how good is the IFS at forecasting how much tax revenue we will get from these increases in tax rates? And it said, well, hasn't been very good until the most recent 2 years when it's really good. And I said, well, we haven't got the data for the last 2 years. We don't know how much. Oh, yeah, that's true. Well, why? This is the problem of dealing with artificial intelligence. I said, well, if it's just a forecast and we don't know what the answer is, it can't have been a good forecast or a bad forecast. It's just nonsense. Well, that's true. I said, well, how's it done for the last 18 years? Every single year, it said, it is forecast that the tax take will be 0.5% of GDP greater than it's actually been. And in this book that I've come across recently, there's a thing that's vaingloriously called the Moynihan curve that says we Brits never really allowed the tax take to be above 36% of GDP. And I give lots and lots of data on that. And I keep thinking I'm going to be caught out one of these days. One of these days we'll go up to 37% of GDP. No, my friends, we have not. Every time the IFS, the OBR forecast, oh, well, they've increased tax rates, so we're going to get 38, 39% of GDP in taxes. No, my friends, it has not happened. Down at 36. And that's why, in my view, Vicky's problem that she told you about this widening gap has occurred, because we keep spending more money, but we keep not raising the taxes. And the essence of insanity is to repeat your mistakes. We keep saying, oh, the answer is to raise more taxes. Huge mistake. Final point. What we need is a model that works. Amazingly, there's a model.
come on.
Yeah, okay. Written 18 months ago, that has correctly forecast what has happened to the economy. And as a businessman, I know I take a completely different way of looking at it from Vicky, but I come to the same conclusion. We are in for a hell of a mess. The economy is going down the tubes very, very fast, and it's going to be a disaster. What we need is to get rid of the OBR and the IFS and get a decent model that is good at predicting what we're going to do, because that's what the economy is going to do, because that's the only way that we can start to change things.
All right, I'm starting to be relieved that your book isn't out yet. But don't forget to go and buy this at the bookstall. Are you doing a signing?
No.
No, you'll have to track it down. He'll sign it for you. Okay, Karl.
Yeah. So I'm going to agree with pretty much everything Jon just said, but I'm going to be much more pessimistic than he was. Oh, okay. How about now?
Yeah, that's
There we go.
No, you're not allowed to touch it. You have to move closer to it. Okay, carry on.
So, in a nutshell, we have, over the last 20 or 30 years, become a low productivity, low growth, low wage economy with a high spend, high tax, high borrowing state attached. And I'm just going to run through a few stats to illustrate that point and then talk about how and why I think that's happened. So, long-run productivity growth in this country, going back decades since the war, 2.1%. Over the last 20 years, it's averaged just a third of that. In fact, economic historians will tell you this is the longest period of stagnation in productivity in this country since the onset of the Industrial Revolution 250 years ago. At the same time, growth has dropped to half its long-run trend rate, if not lower. It used to be the economy would double in size every 26 years. At the moment, it's more like every 48. And in due course, it could be more like... Okay. And in due course, it could be more like every 58 years if the OBR revises down its long-term growth projections, as seems likely. And in terms of GDP per capita, we're only 6% higher than we were in 2007. So we've had very little growth in over 20 years, or going on 20 years, sorry. And ditto with wages. Average wages are only 6% higher than they were almost 20 years ago. They should be 30% higher had we had the pre-financial crisis trendline growth rate. Meantime, in terms of the size of the state, we've now got to a point where spending is approaching 45% of GDP, so post-war high, excluding COVID. This is overwhelmingly driven by debt, partly the way the debt's being structured, and perhaps we can get into that in more detail, but also I think the what's been described as the moron premium under the current government. We are paying far more to service our debt than comparable countries. Additionally, the tax burden is about 36% of GDP, so we are at the Moynihan curve, and the OBR does think it will go up to 37% of GDP. And as Jon was explaining, this will change how people behave. People will not invest, they will leave the country, they'll employ fewer people. And finally, borrowing, the deficit's still 4% of GDP, debt is over 100% of GDP, or on course for that. And given our debt interest payments, that's not sustainable. And we are now stuck in a vicious cycle of higher taxes, higher borrowing to try and fund our spending commitments, which in turn depresses growth, depresses productivity, makes all these problems worse in the long run. And we have to think about how to break out that cycle. So this is where I come on to talk about how and why we're in this position. And I think the first thing to say is some of the Labour government's policies so far are making things worse, undeniably. The increase in employer national insurance, for example, their approach to regulations, the forthcoming employment rights bill. But most of our problems are structural and deep-seated, going back 2 decades, in some cases more like 5. The last government failed to fix them for the most part, and the government before that. These are very significant challenges. I think if you get a group of economists in the room and talk about why has productivity slowed down, there will be a dozen different theories. Everyone accepts there are scores of factors involved, and you can have a long and unproductive conversation about just how you should prioritise those. But there is just one thread here I want to pull on, because I think that is quite illuminating. And that is looking at what has happened to investment and the role of investment in driving growth. So over the last 20 years, the share of economic growth that comes from investment versus labour versus total factor productivity, so ideas, innovation, the share that labour is responsible for has increased substantially. The share of growth driven by investment in machinery, plant, houses, energy, whatever, has fallen and has trended down over the long term and is still going down. And ditto, actually, there's also a decline in total factor productivity, which means there's probably a problem in how we do innovation and take risk in this country, and we should look at universities, and there's cultural factors there. But I want to focus on what's happened on the capital front. Why are we investing less? And I think there's probably 6 main reasons there that I'm going to pick up on. The first, most obvious one, of course, is our planning system, our inability to build homes, infrastructure. In per capita terms, we have the lowest number of houses per person in Europe. If we were to get up to the European average, we'd need to build another 6.5 million homes in England alone. This is an incredibly deep deficit that's built over the course of many decades. And what does that mean? Well, it means it's harder for people to move, so it's harder for labour to be allocated efficiently to where jobs are. It's harder for people to cluster in particular areas, particularly London, the Golden Triangle, Oxford, Cambridge, London. So all the kind of the productivity gains you get from what economists call agglomeration effects don't happen in the same way. And over the course of decades, that adds up. Secondly, energy. We have the highest industrial electricity prices in the developed world. They're 4 times American prices. This has been coming for a long time, but has really come through in the last 2 or 3 years. Our heavy industry, what's left of it, is leaving. Our chemicals industry is closing down. The North Sea is in trouble. And these are the areas where you tend to see far higher rates of productivity growth anyway, just because it's harder to improve productivity in the services economy generally. Balmore's cost disease comes into play. So high energy prices have kind of disrupted some of our most productive and innovative sectors. Part of that is, I think, to do with the way we've done net zero in the energy transition. So instead of energy addition, we've done energy substitution. And actually what we've done is we've reversed a 300-year trend of the amount of energy being used per person going up to that now going down. And there is no way that is not going to feed through into economic growth. So planning, energy, and both of these, I think, are in some ways emanations of the problem with regulation, which Jon described, the growth of the regulatory state. And that also affects business. In the 2010s, despite all the kind of bonfire of the Quangos, bonfire of regulations, we hear again and again, new regulations added at least £6 billion net to the annual costs for businesses over that period. We are making it hard to invest. We're making it harder to take risks, to innovate. And that then is feeding to other cultural factors. Over the last decade, and this is less an issue now, we had a regime of ultra-loose monetary policy, ultra low interest rates, loose monetary policy. This interacted with the planning system works. We weren't building enough houses, but you couldn't get return on your capital elsewhere, so money flows into housing, inflates house prices. This creates problems for young people in particular, and this feeds back into labour market problems. But also you have the issues with zombie firms that survive because there is no or a very low cost of capital. And I don't think you get the economic restructuring you could have seen otherwise. And this maybe feeds back into some of Jon's points about institutions, the OBR and the Bank of England, and the ONS in terms of the data we have, and actually what tools we have for managing and understanding how the economy in Britain is functioning. 2 other things to mention. Firstly, the tax system. The Tories tax handbook has increased from 6,000 pages to over 20,000 pages in the last 25 years. Incredible extra layer of complexity. It has generally not been conducive to investment and business investment. That has changed a bit more in recent years with the permanent full expense introduced by Jeremy Hunt. But on the whole, it is a unhelpful, hard to navigate system which deters investment. And then finally, because I am sort of substituting in for Richard Tice, I'm going to mention immigration, some of Jon's points again. And I think the headline point here is the era of mass migration, which really begins in 1998, and that's the first time net migration passes 100,000 per year, has coincided with this period where the trend rates of productivity, GDP capita, etc., have collapsed. Obviously, correlation is not causation. And just talking about there are all sorts of factors at play here. But I think this is probably an underestimated one, where there are some elements of causation and some of substitution. So, migrants can come, they can bring skills, they can bring energy and hard work, but they can't bring a mile of road or a new railway station or a house. So if we are growing the population through migration faster than we are growing the capital stock, that is going to wane on growth. And a lot of this, I should say, is enormously controversial. There's a lot of fighting over how does migration relate to productivity. But I will just quote the 2022 annual report of the Migration Advisory Committee, which is the official body that advises the government on what its migration policy should be. And they, I think there is, in the UK context, freedom of movement acted as a shock to labour markets. And I think we've probably seen something again very recently with the very high rate of migration we've seen since 2021. And the final point on that is that net migration since then has been 2.6 million people, which means that 1 in every 25 people living in Britain today has arrived in just the last 4 years. Yet we're in a situation where GDP per capita is only just back where it was at the end of 2019, and the economy is not much bigger in terms of headline GDP. So if it's not been a factor pulling down productivity and growth, it's certainly not been one that's helping it. The overall takeaway is we're in a terrible situation, and there's lots and lots of factors feeding into this. And for various reasons, governments will be very reluctant to graft enough on any of these, because politically, a lot of them, like planning, for example, are very difficult to deal with.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for mentioning risk, because you've given me an excuse to plug the thing that I've written. I wrote a letter on liberty about risk, on sale now at the bookstall upstairs. It's a lot shorter than this and a lot cheaper. All right, Rob, I'm really hoping you've got, if not some cause for optimism, maybe some ideas of what people could do about this.
Yes, thank you for neatly introducing me. When I've been telling people that I'm going to be speaking on a session called Decline and Fall of the British Economy, they go, "Oh, I'm not going to that. That's too depressing." So I'm glad to see so many horror fans here on a show. Yes, I thought given I know a little bit about particularly Vicky and Jon, I thought I'd try to accentuate the positive here a bit. And what's come out in this speech is kind of a bit of a roller coaster. There's good news and there's bad news. The good news is that in many ways, the lives that we live today in the developed world are as good as it gets. The bad news is that the state of the economy is such that, well, the way we live today may be as good as it gets. Before I get back to all the doom and gloom, I just did want to temper some of what we've heard with a bit of historical perspective, which may come across a bit like the Four Yorkshiremen sketch. Our lives are so much better than they were in the past, in material terms at least. In real terms, wages are about double what they were 50 years ago. Many of the things we want to buy are cheaper. For example, 30 years ago, back in 1995, my flatmate bought a personal computer. It's the first time I'd lived in a house that had a personal computer. And by modern standards, it was ridiculously slow, required a dial-up modem to access what little there was of the internet, and it cost £1,500 in 1995 prices, which is equivalent to over £3,000 today. The cost of buying a new car will take as big a chunk of your wages as it would have done back in 1972, but it will cost you a lot less to run because they're much more fuel efficient and much nicer to drive. With features such as sat-nav to tell you where you're going. For those of a certain age trying to navigate around London using the A to Z, going, right, I'm on page 21, I need to get to somewhere on page 85, and I have to flick through page 46 and 73 to get to there. That's the idea of a nice screen and a voice telling you when to turn is all very good. And in passing, that leaves us with a sort of measurement problem, along with all the other measurement problems. Is a lot of stuff that we enjoy today is free. So how do you measure that in GDP statistics? We are better off, but because there is no exchange going on, it can be quite tricky to measure those things. In 1970, food took up 21% of average incomes. It's now about half that, although prices are rising, as we've seen. Our health has improved so much. There's one thing that people may not realise is that the age standardised death rate from cardiovascular disease in the UK fell by about 75% between 1961 and 2021. That's astonishing. The idea of dying from a heart attack now, you feel unlucky if that happens, whereas it was quite routine back in the day. Those weight loss drugs even seem to be turning the tide on obesity, and are effective against diabetes, may be effective against dementia and a bunch of other chronic conditions as well. I argued this case yesterday in the balloon debate on the greatest scientific development of the last 20 years and got kicked out in the first round, which proves the limitations of democracy, and that's why we need a benign dictatorship. Official unemployment is under 5% still. And those of us who have been on the wrong end of unemployment when it was a lot higher will be very grateful for that, even if there is a problem with working age people living on welfare, which may come up in the final session today, by the way. But most people seeking a job can get one of some description. So there are plenty of reasons to be cheerful as well. Sometimes we should just stop and allow ourselves to be amazed at the many things that we've done. They are the product of investing in research and development somewhere in the world, and of which we don't do enough of in the UK, and market economies encouraging new products and new services. So that's the good news. The bad news, it's also the case that, as people have said, the cost of buying a home has gone through the roof. Energy bills should be declining, but they've shot up. As a variety of energy bosses told Parliament this week, even if the price of gas halved or even went to zero, bills would either stay the same or go up, just from policy costs alone. That's how mad things are getting. The UK government is drowning in debt, but thankfully the French, the Italians and the Japanese are even worse off, so at least we've got Schadenfreude on our side. That said, the markets seem more worried about our debt than about other people's, because we've got persistently high inflation and our general direction of the government not grasping the nettle in terms of giving the markets a narrative about how this is going to change. And so we're paying a premium on how much we have to borrow. Our balance of payments is poor. Manufacturing and production in general is suffering. We've even started to put off life sciences companies. I mean, life sciences companies love the UK and they're starting to leave. I could carry on the litany, but others have done it so well. So I'll... one thing, and Karl rightly points out, these things aren't new. That this sort of secular decline in Western economies has been going on for 30, 40 years, whatever you want to choose as your starting point. So unravelling all of that is going to be very difficult. And it has got much worse in the UK since the financial crisis. So the one good piece of news I want to end with is that much of this is solvable because it is the fault of bad policies, and we can change policies. Where we've had free markets, they've tended to work well. Where we've had things that run by the state or regulated by the state, they would work less well. So, I mean, Rachel Reeves's approach to a gasping UK economy is to strangle it. Get back to life, come on! No, don't. That's not the way to do it. We've promoted renewable energy at the cost of higher bills and lower energy security, impoverishing customers and consumers and driving away industry. We can't build anything more because of endless regulation. Just changing those policies, just a few policies, would cost the government nothing. Probably save a lot of money by sacking a load of bureaucrats and encourage more activity, boosting tax revenues. And we should cut taxes too, and that means the government doing less. The triple lock on state pensions should be scrapped because that is a time bomb waiting to go off. It's unaffordable because pensions keep rising faster than earnings. I think there's a decent case for higher interest rates, or at least keeping them as high as they are now, rather than the assumption of constantly cutting, because as Karl said, cheap credit has been keeping too many poorly performing companies on life support, and that's dragged down the performance of the economy as a whole. Oh, and the supposedly neutral civil service and the quangos will push back on any attempt to change all these policies. There are some things that we couldn't control. We couldn't control the fact there was a pandemic. We couldn't control the fact that the US mortgage market went tits up in 2007 and so on. And the current bubble over artificial intelligence is worrying many people. And we face some demographic challenges as well, because we are an ageing population. And while those things are solvable in many ways, they still represent a bit of a challenge to us. But if we could stop doing bad things, stop doing bad policies, and make it worthwhile for people to do useful things, that would be a very good start indeed.